Hello and good evening. My name is Nicole Burton, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, Protecting the Unprotected, Creating a Safe Environment for Communication and Healing for Victims of Abuse and Trauma. We have an esteemed panel of guests here to discuss the important issues highlighted in Jean Coppin's play, Unprotected, currently streaming as video on demand. And I saw it today, I can tell you, it's fabulous. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the Puffin Foundation for its generous support, which allowed us to present this discussion tonight. First, a couple of suggestions to make watching and listening easier. To see all the panelists, we recommend you select Gallery View. That's in the top right corner of your Zoom screen, Gallery View. To see only the speakers during the panel discussion, we suggest hiding the profile pictures or names of everyone who's not on stage. In a little while, we will invite all of you to turn your cameras on to ask questions and join the discussion. In case you need a refresher to hide people who are not on stage, this is how you do it. Next to the video camera icon at the bottom left of your Zoom screen, click on the tiny arrow. It looks like an upside down V. When you click this, you'll see a box pop up. Click Video Settings. In this Video Settings window, you'll see a video of yourself. Scroll down, and underneath that, you'll see a box next to Hide Non-Video Participants. Click on that to hide everyone but the speakers. It makes for a better viewing experience. In case you have any tech issues, please use the chat box. Click on the bottom, the chat at the bottom center of your screen to ask us what to do. We're monitoring the chat and we'll be happy to help you as best we can. Now, Ann Timmons will tell you a little about Pipeline before we get started.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you all for joining us here tonight. All of us here at Pipeline want to thank you for coming and for believing in us and our work. Our supporters are the lifeline of Pipeline Playwrights. As you may know, we're a collective of women playwrights who envision a world where women's stories take center stage. Pipeline seeks to close the theater gender gap, one play, one reading, one production at a time. We create opportunities for underrepresented voices, particularly women in their second act, to share their stories. Our mission is important because plays written by women or women-identifying playwrights are underrepresented in productions on American theater stages. But we're changing that. And to those of you who've contributed to us in the past, we would like to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your support. Your contributions are essential to helping us launch our productions. As you may know, ticket prices don't even begin to cover the cost of production. Everything that goes into staging a play, paying everyone, renting the theater space, all of the expenses, these are not covered by ticket costs. So your donation helps us cover these expenses, including sets, costumes, lighting, all these things that are needed to bring women's stories to life. Now, as always, there's information about our upcoming programs and productions on our website, and you can find out also more via Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And while you're on our website, feel free to navigate on over to our donate page and see how you can make a donation to support us. We're sharing our website and social media links, hopefully in the chat box now. Yes, there we go. Crystal's putting them in now. So you can go to the chat box and hop on the link right now, or save it, copy it down, and visit us later. Unprotected is still streaming as video on demand for 1 week only, one more week, until November 22nd. So if you'd like to see it again or share it with anyone who hasn't seen it, make sure to check out this link that Crystal's putting in the chat box now for tickets. Share it widely with your friends, with your social media. This is a play that is not to be missed, and I'm sure you agree if you've seen it. In December, we'll have our annual holiday party on December 15th, and we hope you can make it. It's going to be an evening for us to just sort of reconnect with you. Would be nice if it's in person, but again, it's going to be over Zoom, so we can reconnect with as many of you who can make it from all the corners of the earth. We hope to see you December 15th. And now I will turn our program over to Nicole Burton and Crystal Attaway, who will introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Anne. Our first panelist is Stephanie Douglas. Stephanie works as a school social worker in Brooklyn, New York, in an intentionally diverse elementary school focused on integrating the arts and sustainability in a holistic education. She has supported the implementation of trauma-informed practices aligned with a restorative justice model across her school community. Prior to working in schools, Stephanie spent several years working on immediate crisis response teams, supporting trauma survivors and providing trauma-focused therapies to survivors of all ages. Thanks for being here, Stephanie. Our next panelist is Carol Cadby. Carol has been a theatre educator for 35 plus years on the high school, college, and professional level. She currently teaches acting at the Rome School of Music, Drama and Art, Catholic University, and at the Theatre Lab Acting Conservatory, and taught in the Arlington Public Schools for 28 years. She's also a fabulous director. And she's a Hispanic film, TV, and stage actor, as well as an executive coach specializing in public speaking and leadership presence. Crystal, will you introduce the other panel members?
I would be delighted. Our other panelists you will recognize as members of our Unprotected and Pipeline team, which I had the pleasure to produce Unprotected this fall. First, we have the playwright of Unprotected, Jean Coppin. Next is Catherine Schripp, who directed Unprotected. Catherine previously directed A Very Present Present last year, Heartland in the summer, and our last Fringe show, as well as a number of readings over the years. We obviously love working with her very, very much. Next, we have Nicole Ruth Marie, an incredibly talented actor who played the role of Regina in Unprotected and was also in Heartland earlier this year. And Diane Cooper Gould, another very talented and fabulous actor and also an education advocate. She was also in, she was Sarah in She was Sarah in Unprotected and also in A Very Present Present last year. She's been in a bunch of Pipeline readings and productions as well, including last week's reading of Nicole Burton's Wednesdays in Mississippi. And finally, Pat Connolly will be moderating the discussion. Oh, I see someone, I'm letting them in right now. Oh, you beat me to it. Okay. Welcome. Thank you guys for being here. It's so lovely to see all of you.
Thanks, Crystal, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to be asking specific questions to each of the panelists and give them each time to respond. Then we will open it up for discussion with everyone. And of course, the panelists during the panel discussion can respond to each other as well. First, we're going to start with Jean telling us how she came to write Unprotected. Jean?
Hi, everyone. So I was actually writing a different play in 2016 when an incident happened that I think you'll all probably remember. It's when then candidate Trump comments about from Access Hollywood came out. It was very big in the news, but something that struck me was when I was paying attention to Twitter, I saw a lot of women were mentioning how triggered they were by these comments, and also the casual nature with which they were treated by so many. That it seemed like there was just a lack of concern about them as women in general. They felt suddenly abandoned and vulnerable, and many said that they were actually reliving their own assault or abuse that they thought they had moved past. And they suddenly felt just completely unprotected in the country because of this high-level person and what they had said, and that it seemed to have no consequences for them. I knew then that I wanted to write a different play than I was writing. I wanted to write about how events and comments themselves can trigger trauma for many women. But I also knew that by writing this play and by presenting it, that it could itself be triggering for people who either attended or were involved with it. And so we knew going into this production that we needed to be prepared to deal with the subject matter and with audience members and their possible reaction to the content.
Thanks, Jean. As theater artists, we want to address these important issues that Jean was talking about on stage, and we want to engage in a dialogue with each other and our audiences. At the same time, how do we do it in a way that is sensitive to our audiences and our collaborators? But first, let's get some background and talk about the experience of trauma for women and girls as Jean depicts in the play. I'm going to turn first to Stephanie Douglas and ask you some questions to give us some background and a foundation. First of all, what are the ways victims of sexual abuse and assault respond to this kind of trauma?
Thanks so much, Pat. It's really wonderful to be here tonight. And I think that in trying to understand some of the common reactions to trauma, it's important to note that you cannot know exactly what one person is going to go through without hearing their story. So it's really important to consider the variance of experience that people have. That being said, there are some common reactions that can happen, and something that can be really helpful for all survivors is to know that what they are going through is not something that is so different from what other people have gone through before them. So some of the reactions that can go on include hyperarousal, right? So feeling, or hypervigilance, feeling really activated and aware of your surroundings. Some of the startle response, feeling a little bit jumpy. That can be a reaction following trauma. There's also the idea of re-experiencing traumatic events, right? So this could come through having flashbacks, it could come through having nightmares, it could come through the intrusive thoughts where you're going through your day and then a thought that you don't want comes into your mind connected to the trauma. There also can be cognitive or emotional symptoms. So this can be patterns of thinking where you are basically like redefining your thought pattern and experience the world as connected to the trauma, and sometimes having inaccurate thinking patterns or patterns that are just shifted as a result of the traumatic event, as well as emotional symptoms, feeling sad, anxiety, like things of that nature. There can also be avoidance that comes up, right? So talking about trauma is really, really, really challenging to do. And it is a really common reaction to not want to do it. If something makes us feel uncomfortable, if something is hard to talk about, it's really normal to not want to talk about it. So following a traumatic event, it's really common for people to avoid talking about it, numb it out, try to put it into a space in your brain where you don't think about it or you don't talk about it. And they're like, that avoidance is also a really common response to trauma. So all of these sort of cohort or these big clusters are important to consider when bringing a trauma framework to understanding anyone's experience.
When you and I spoke the other night, you mentioned that it's not only the actual victims of assault who experience the trauma, but it's also can be family members are affected and friends, and it sort of permeates through a person's circle of their network of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that all of us have some type of relationship with trauma, right? And so when we think about a relationship, it could be something where we've directly experienced trauma or where we know someone who's experienced trauma. And I think it's important to note the statistical significance of trauma. There is the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Effects Study, like notes that 2 out of 3 people, it's like 61% of people report having at least one marker on the ACEs measure. So this is where we know that people have some experience with trauma in some way. And even if you haven't directly experienced trauma, you know someone who has. And I think that this effect of being a person, like if you know that someone you cared about was really hurt, then it becomes a questioning of yourself of how did I not keep them safe, right? And we saw some of this play out in the story that we heard, or and it can cause just an emotional reaction. And even for people who are not directly experiencing trauma, but might be first responders, you can experience vicarious trauma in a very real way, where by being exposed to trauma on a regular basis, it starts to impact your sense of understanding of the world and your sense of safety in the world, right? So when we're thinking about trauma, it's really a disruption in how we feel safe in the world. You know, we're born thinking that the world is safe. Then something really scary happens where all of a sudden that is brought into question. Is the world really safe? Can I go out in the world? Can I trust other people? And this disruption can be rebuilt. So that, you know, there's a lot of resiliency that can come through trauma, but it's very important to note that when your sense of safety is challenged, there's going to be a process to go through, and that's going to be true for your loved ones as well. So it's not just one person, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you watch the play, can you talk about what you saw specifically among the characters in the play in terms of their responses to trauma themselves or to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to unpack in looking at the characters, the character development, and how the characters are interacting with each other. I think it's important to note, I kind of went over some of the common like symptoms or reactions to trauma. The trauma like lens or understanding really views symptoms as adaptations, right? So human beings are really adaptive. We figure out how to make it work. When we're thinking about adaptations, though, some of them can be focused on like in helping us to cope in a really healthy way, and some of them might be not as healthy, right? Healthy. And so from a trauma perspective, we call this like extreme coping mechanisms, right? You're coping, it just might be in a way that is maladaptive or not necessarily supporting resiliency. And so I think one of the things, Pat, when we spoke, that happened in one of the very early on scenes is between Sarah and Ed, where there was a bottle of wine that was opened, and immediately I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I wonder how this is going to be connected, because for some people drinking, like, and that can be a way to be avoiding your emotion, right? And that is a common reaction to trauma. And so that could be viewed as like an extreme coping mechanism if it's taken into excess. I think for one of the other characters, you know, for Grace, there was, as the story progressed, there was a real clear statement of I avoid going to that hallway, right? And like commenting on some of the symptoms that were specifically re-experienced. And even in the cutting of the hair scene, right? That one was so powerful to me, because when trauma happens and that sense of safety is disrupted, there's a lack of empowerment that comes. And that to me was an empowerment move, right? I'm going to take control back of this situation where I felt out of control. So it was very powerful. You know, I think Ed was also one of the really, really interesting characters to me. Because there was this hypervigilance, right, of trying to maintain this sense of safety all of the time, right? There was an awareness of a need for self-defense, an awareness of this is how I want my daughter to be interacting, at the same time that there was the duality of the reinforcement of the patriarchal systems that he was like upholding in many ways, right? Through the comments that he was making towards his wife. Again, like connected to the wine in that scene, right? Where, you know, he made the statement, and I apologize if I misquote it, but it was something to the effect of, you know, like the person, Sarah said, I might have so much wine I would pass out. And he was like, that's okay, I can work with that. And that to me is like, at the same time as there's hypervigilance, there's also upholding of this patriarchal system of, you know, harm and power. So all of these things can exist in once, right? At once. It's not a binary of, it's complex. So I think for some of the other characters, you know, for Regina, there was an avoidance of understanding how her child could have upheld some of these systems. And, you know, for Zach, again, like I'm thinking about like patriarchal systems, right? That it's like he was operating from a place of wanting to fit in with his friends and wanting to be accepted, right? And then there becomes, the insecurity and the concern about like, how do I stand up in this moment? So I think it was a lot of really complexity in that relationship, and in understanding how these different characters could each like come into this space and have their own experience. And then, for Doug, we learn a lot about his history. And one of them, I think I actually had to like take a moment in the play when he was repeatedly saying, I don't want to talk about this to Sarah. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to talk about this. Like you could hear the avoidance and the emotion and the power in his voice. And that is like, it was really interesting to me that then she still had a hard time responding to that boundary, and for Sarah, I think you heard in so many different ways, the ways that her symptoms could come up with her own connection to trauma, of re-experiencing, and I think one thing that is important to note to a trauma is that there's often very heightened sensory memories that can come through. And this is in like the re-experiencing symptoms. So remembering things like sounds and smells and like any sensory input that could have gone on in the relationship between like while a trauma was occurring was some of the things that I think Sarah really demonstrated.
And
so that was a lot.
Yeah. I'm going to ask Carol to turn on her camera for the next part of the discussion, and ask Stephanie for you to stay too. Carol is has 28 years of experience in Arlington County schools. The incident that starts off the action of the play is Grace coming in. She's a 15-year-old girl, and she doesn't really want to talk about it, but she wants to talk about it. As a former teacher, do you think her school ultimately has a role in addressing the issue?
First of all, thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. Yes, I mean, I think a school definitely has a role to play. The question is the circumstances under which it happened. So in the play, it was in a hallway, and the question in my head is, where is the supervisor that's supervising the hallway that would witness that? If nobody witnessed it or was willing to come forward, then a counselor, which is usually the person that you go to in a school, is a counselor, and they can't really address the issue unless it's brought forward or unless it's witnessed. And I think that now there's a keen awareness. I think we've changed a lot, thank goodness. And students are very keen on communicating with their counselor and asking for time and asking for guidance and an adult figure. I think that students really do need the adult to help them kind of navigate through these waters. And whereas before, a student might hold it inside and try to control the trauma themselves, I think that now that has changed a lot. But I think that that's where I'm a little bit like, yes, the school had a role in it, but if nobody witnessed it, and if the kids won't come forward, then the student is by themselves. So I think that there is sometimes in schools, though, a lot of the other kids talk, and they talk to each other, and then eventually, at times, it comes out, and then the counselor gets brought in and intervenes. But yes, definitely, definitely, kid is there for 8 or 10 hours a day if you're doing after school activities.
Stephanie, you're shaking your head. So you're dealing with some of these issues right now in school with younger children. Yes. And Jean corrected me. I said that Grace was 15, but Grace was 17 and Zach was 15 in the play. So that makes them a little bit older, but still, they're still in high school, and the same issues would apply. What do you do, Stephanie, in the school where
Yeah.
you are?
Yeah. Carol, I just want to say that when we were talking about like supervision was the first thing that came to my mind too, in responding of like, it's like, where are the grownups? Because there needs to be a high level of supervision at all points in a school. And that's like so much of trying to manage a big group of kids is like, where's your body positioned so that you can see different corners. So I think some of the things, I work in an elementary school, so it is different in, you know, kind of how the kids will listen and how they'll talk back. But some of the issues of boundaries and consent, you know, we really try to be proactive in my school specifically about like how we're having conversations about boundaries and consents and different parts of bodies and all these things. And we start doing it in kindergarten, right? Because kids in kindergarten can understand what personal space is and they understand what consent is. And I think one of the hopes in trying to reinforce you know, a culture of consent and a culture of awareness about your own personal space and your own boundaries and the boundaries of others is that we work to sort of disrupt some of the systems that have historically been in place where there also has been progress, right? And I think, Carol, you noted that too, that there have been shifts in how kids will talk about you know, talk about circumstances that have happened. And, you know, I've experienced that in elementary school where they will tell you all sorts of things, and as well as in middle and high school, where if you're one of the trusted adults, they will come to you and talk about what happened. And I think it's also important for kids to have not just one trusted adult. Everybody needs a village, because it might not be the easiest conversation to have for the first time with your mom or with your dad, right? Like it might actually be helpful to process with another grown-up that you trust in order to hopefully, you know, have that conversation with somebody in your family, because healing, having a healthy attachment is actually one of the things that can foster resiliency when trying to recover from trauma.
Now, both of you have been teaching for a while and have been in the schools. Carol, I know you've retired from that teaching, but so have you seen a shift in the last, say, so Jean mentioned the Access Hollywood 2016, and she mentioned Me Too. Have you seen a shift? I know, Carol, you and I talked about that in how things used to be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so 35 years ago in education, in theater, in the world at large, women didn't have really a say or a role, and everything was just kind of status quo. Oh yeah, you know, everybody's just joking. Why are you taking it seriously? Why are you so offended by stuff? And now there's this awareness that what we say and what we do and how we treat women, especially, matters. And I say especially because it's everybody. Whereas before there was a certain type of person that, you know, kind of was in charge. Now there's more democracy of who can be um, part of society and be able to um, be of worth. And in the theater world, especially, women were nothing. I was looking back, I was looking on my resume from, you know, 30, 40 years ago. And I realized that every film, movie, or stage production I had done was directed by a man. There were no women. And now uh, there is a conscious awareness that women are not represented. It's what Anne said, you know, women playwrights are not represented. Well, it's the same in the acting and directing fields.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this change is shifting, and the younger generation, the kids, they're listening, they're getting it. In high school, there are the kids that don't advocate for themselves, but then there are the kids that advocate for them. So one of the big changes I've noticed is the advocacy. Everybody advocates for each other, and especially in a theater environment. And I get called out all the time. It's like, no, Miss Gabby, you can't say that. You can't. And things come out of my mouth, and I'm like, I can't. I can't use the terminology or the jargons or the things that 30, 40 years ago were dismissive. And I think it's very, very cool that we have come to this point. Have we addressed all the issues? No. And I think that there's still a lot of advocacy that needs to happen. But I think and especially coming out of COVID, I think kids were really affected by COVID, and they have come out the other side. They're very vulnerable and very susceptible. And we are giving people space. When I teach now on the college level, there's always, I do a safety check at the beginning of every class to make sure that everybody's okay, everybody is aware of what we're going to be doing today, and how they are emotionally and physically able to participate. And in directing as well, the director has to be very aware. And there's a check-in. You can't just like start doing something because you're ready to go and the rest of the company is not. And I think that that's a big change.
Stephanie, you're shaking your head too about changes.
Yeah, I mean, we hope there are changes, right? That's what we hope. I mean, progress is incremental, right? Like I don't know that any of us on this screen, as much as we would like to, are going to eliminate like all of the patriarchal and racialized system that exists in our country. But I believe that us coming together in community is actually how we move things forward. And I think, you know, I don't believe that when I was in kindergarten, I had a conversation about consent. So I think that turnaround in just, you know, in 30 some years is demonstrating incremental progress. And I think, Carol, you were talking about a check-in, and I think that's very grounded in restorative practices and trauma-informed practices of like, how are we building routines and rituals that are providing a sense of safety at home, yes, and with, you know, your family or whomever is raising you, but also across all of our community spaces. You know, it's really helpful to know what to expect. That is something that fosters a sense of safety. And the idea of a check-in, of just acknowledging how we're coming into any space that we walk into, and acknowledging that everybody's not going to be in the same space, and kids in particular come in all different kinds of ways. You know, I mean, it's so much joy, right? And also so much insight and so much this, you know, it's literally like they physically see the world in a different way when they're in kindergarten because they're looking up at everything, you know, there's wide eyes. And it's like, how are we acknowledging that and also working to foster this idea where kids can have a strong sense of their identities and exploring their identities and understanding how that's connected to their families and the communities that they're a part of. Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot to talk about how COVID has impacted everybody. Like I said earlier, we all have a relationship with trauma. We just went through a global trauma. That's what COVID would be, you know, defined as. And so, especially as we're in community with each other moving forward, we need to treat each other with an extra amount of care and understanding, you know, and I hope our kids are I hope we're helping our kids make progress, and then hopefully they continue that trajectory, you know, and success won't be linear, you know, it's the graphic where it's like up and down, but hopefully there will be incremental progress.
So let me bring in our production team, Catherine, Diane, and Nicole Ruth Marie, because Carol, you mentioned the check-in process. And so let me turn to Catherine and talk about this particular production. And so you have this script you want to direct, and there are issues. It's not a comedy. There might be some funny moments, and there's cake. There's cake in it.
Yeah.
But how did you think about approaching you're planning for rehearsing and working with the actors on some of these issues?
Well, I mean, every play is an emotional journey. So, and even in comedies, there are instances of trauma. And so, I mean, I think for me, I try and come into any script, but certainly with this script, with the idea of respecting not only the action of what's happening, but the characters and then also the actors. It's very important to me that actors feel comfortable to talk about whatever they need to talk about. My rehearsal process includes a lot of just being there and being with the characters, and when I'm directing a play, I don't believe that I'm the only artist in the room. And so I rely on the actors to be there and help create this and create their characters. And so, so for me, with this particular play, I think I wanted to make clear to everyone that that I understood that this is a big topic and can bring up a lot of big emotions, and that if people needed to have extra space or needed to talk to me separately, that they could do that. And Sophia, who played Grace, for her big monologue, I took that time. We worked separate from everybody else, just to have a closed rehearsal so that we could talk about what she was feeling and what she was portraying, and how we could best tell that story, not only with her voice, but with her body, in a way that she was comfortable with, but then also in a way that tells the story. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yes, it does. Would you talk a little bit? I know that we talked about this, you had a check-in process with your stage manager, and would you talk a little bit about that, how that worked?
Sure. Okay, so it used to be, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it was before. It used to be that when there was a fight on stage before rehearsals and performances, we would do fight calls where the actors would go through the fight choreography slowly, and then at half speed, and then at full speed. And there was just this whole process of making sure that they knew how their bodies were going to interact for the choreography of that fight. And that's been happening for years. But a newer development in theater is that we have intimacy calls, which is in this show was a process where we had Sarah and Ed, Diane and Chris come and spend some time to check in, and our stage manager was our both our fight captain and our intimacy captain, where she would lead the fight calls, and then she also led the intimacy calls. And the intimacy calls she would ask the actors questions like, how's everybody feeling today? Is there any problems? Similarly in the fight call, does anybody have any physical problems? Is there anything that isn't going right, or any concerns? And then would go through particularly the moments of physical intimacy, the hugs and the kiss and all of that stuff, so that the actors knew, first of all, they had the opportunity to sort of get married, which Diane will talk more about that, because but they would get married before the show, and then they would get divorced at the end of the show to have their complete journey as actors, to sort of have that this is on time and this is off time. And I think that process, I had never gone through well, we did an intimacy call in Heartland, but this was very different in that there was a lot of things going on, a lot of different emotional things going on. But I don't think that, I think it is such a wonderful thing to acknowledge that actors are coming into a space with as their own people and in their own experiences, and that it is not a switch that we, as the director and the playwright and the producer, it's not a switch that we flip and say, okay, well, now you do your character stuff, and whatever you walk away with, not our problem. Like, it is wonderful to me that we're taking the time to make sure that everybody's comfortable in the place that they're in. And, and that's not to say that certain things don't have to happen in the play. I mean, certain things do have to happen, but to be able to talk honestly about what people are comfortable with, I think it not only helps the actors, but it helps the play be fuller, because then the actors are more comfortable with the things that their bodies are doing.
Let's hear from the actors, Nicole, Ruth Marie, and Diane. So your approach, how do you separate yourself from both of these characters? One, Regina is a feminist, and she's an activist, and she's very strong. And then her sister and brother-in-law accuse her son of something that it just sort of comes at her. And Sarah, of course, it becomes apparent after not too long that she's seeing what's happening to her daughter, and she's reliving the trauma. So how do you, each of you, how do you approach a character like this and keep it separate so that you can, and this is probably a question everybody has about every character, but how do you, especially when it's very emotional and possibly triggering issues, how do you keep it separate? Diane, Nicole, who wants to go first?
I'll shoot in. It's fine. Well, one thing that just to piggyback a little bit off of what Catherine was talking about with the intimacy calls and the marriage and the divorce at the end, beginning and end, that was something I had never experienced either in my career. And as Carol had mentioned, as Catherine mentioned, when I was young and acting full time, you had to take your shirt off for a show. So this is the rehearsal, you take your shirt off, And it's usually a guy telling you to take your shirt off, and then another guy in the room that you're doing a scene with. And at the time, it was like, you do it, you don't complain, you do it. And nobody cares how you're feeling about it. You do it and you make it look good. And then you have to put up with everybody's jokes about it. And one thing I do love about working with Pipeline and Catherine is that, first of all, in an environment that is run by women, there is an acknowledgement of the fact that I'm a human being. But I also think that is a shift in the mindset, a huge shift. And I think DC theater, but theater across the country, has also had a reckoning since Me Too about how female in the entertainment industry are treated, females and also males. But I think there has been a large disparity. This isn't to discount men who have experienced sexual trauma, and we know that they have as well. And those stories have also been coming out, which is critically important, like in the play. So initially, when we started talking about the intimacy coordinator, I was like, oh gosh, that seems really weird. I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. But I really grew to appreciate the intimacy calls. So having that every day, that check-in, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And then that made me feel safer as an actor, much safer as an actor. And also the marriage was we would give each other a high five. I mean, in a way, it wasn't like we weren't going through a ceremony or anything, just in case the audience is unsure about that. You know, we'd give each other like a double high five. And then at the end of the night, we'd give each other another double high five. And that was kind of, it was really great. And I've never experienced anything like that. It was, and I actually did that with Grace as well, the girl playing my daughter, to say, okay, you're my daughter right now. Okay, now you're my peer. Because there is a level of intimacy and physical contact and familiarity that you would have with your child versus a coworker, or with your husband versus a male coworker. And I think that making that boundary of headspace was really, really important. And it sets very clear lines, because I know theater's it's one of the most wonderful workplaces, but it is very weird because you have to get very close and be very trusting and very intimate with people you've just met, or you don't know real well, and you're supposed to turn it on and be present and be totally vulnerable with them, but you don't really know them really quickly, and then you have to step away, and then when a show's over, sometimes you don't see them ever again, or sometimes you don't see them for months, and it's just a really strange off and on. And then what you can see bleed into that is people do confuse personal lives and professional lives, and I think you see that in the tabloids, but that's also it's kind of a reality because it comes from this forced intimacy. And I don't want to talk too much before I let Nicole speak her piece. So Nicole, why don't you jump in and say some stuff?
Sure. So I didn't do any of the intimacy stuff except for I did have fight call, and like we would do like the with Zach, the child that played my son. No. What? Oh God, I'm blanking on his name right now.
Okay.
Oh God, Caden. Thank you. What's we call it? I would, kind of give like a little high five, like a little hand hug, and then we check and like, it's like you're my son, and then afterwards, no, you're not. And then with Phil, who played my husband Doug, we would like do air kisses backstage. Like that was just our thing. I don't know why we chose that to be our thing, but it was just like little like European like mwah mwah mwah, like that was what we did, to say we're husband and wife, and then afterwards we just kind of hugged each other after we walked off stage. Those were our two things to start the evening and then to end the evening. But yeah, as for like how to separate my character from myself, I'm not entirely sure if I can actually say it in words. I just kind of flip a switch in my head of like, okay, I'm this person now. And then I kind of when I walk off stage, all right, and now I'm back to me. It's something that I've done for a very long time, and I'm probably not saying it in a way that sounds fun and interesting, but it's truly just a switch in my head that I know how to access it, and then I know how to turn it off. I just think of it like playing pretend. Like we all know the game, the floor is lava. And if someone yells the floor is lava, everyone automatically, even if you're older and everything else, and everyone kind of starts to like look for a place to like, whether or not they move or not is completely subjective, but like everyone kind of looks for a place to move. And then when the game is over, if the game ever actually ends, because sometimes it just peters off, and it's the same thing. I like to think it's just the floor is lava. The floor is not lava anymore.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Carol, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Carol. Oh,
I just said, Carol, you were shaking your head. You're an actor, I know. So,
yeah. So this whole thing about the character and the person, it gets tricky because the only thing you really have as an actor is your instrument, and your instrument is your physicality and your memories and your thoughts and your ideas, and then it's a matter of merging you with the character, but knowing that it is a combination. It's you character, and then when you get off stage, it's you again, and being able to do that So Sandy Meisner, his big thing is that you use the magic as if. It's as if this would happen in your imagination. And so there's actor training techniques that get you into that space that you realize this isn't real. This is, and as a teacher, I always reinforce that the theater is an illusion of the truth. It's not real. And as an actor, you have to keep that in mind. There needs to be that 10% control of you that knows that this is not real. And the method has been kind of bastardized over time, but the idea that you submerge yourself completely and you lose yourself in the character, and that is not healthy because it causes all this that we've been talking about. So I think the whole field of acting, like Diane was saying, is just it's weird. It's very, very weird, and it requires a lot of like yin and yang and dispensing with belief, but yet believing. And it's not a science; it's a craft, and it takes a long time to be able to do what Nicole knows how to do instinctually.
Yeah.
And so
Stephanie wanted to. I'm sorry, Diane.
go ahead.
Stephanie
No,
wanted
go
to say
ahead.
something. Oh, I thought you had some.
I'm chuckling because my partner's an actor, and this is like a whole different lens that I'm like hearing
Oh,
about.
interesting.
And I also, I think for folks who work in schools, like there is always this sort of like tension in anything where you're like evoking human emotion, where it's how do I bring myself and have boundaries? Like how do I do both those things at the same time? And some of that tension is resonating with me. Sorry, Diane, what were you gonna say?
No, it's okay. I was gonna throw in too just a couple things. I think the process is different for every actor, and I think different things are effective for every actor, and and some things are not effective, right? I feel very strongly that one needs to do one's therapy outside of your workplace. So you shouldn't be trying to work through your own issues on the stage. You need to be doing that on your own time in a therapy office, just like you wouldn't go to your accounting firm and do your therapy at your desk. You're not going to do that in the theater. And I think one place that it can get difficult for actors, and I can talk about my process a little bit for this play, and it's not necessarily as difficult in every play, but sometimes there's something that really affects you, or you're telling a story that's very intimate. Is how do I not, if I do have personal feelings coming up, how do I deal with this? And sometimes actors don't deal with it well, and sometimes they do, just like any other person or artist. So for me, I do know that without going too much into detail, I did experience some significant trauma when I was younger. And, I think a lot of people do, like Stephanie said, and I don't know if I know a single woman who hasn't experienced some sort of, at the very least, heckling, but often much more, whether it be an assault or it be an inappropriate comment or it be threatening your job or harassment, whatever. So yeah, that can come into your work. And so for me, I feel that I have pretty good boundaries like Nicole, but there were definitely times when I would say, well, based on my personal experience as Diane, this is what I'm thinking. And I would just check in with Catherine. So Catherine and I would go off and have a conversation, and I would say, okay, am I right in saying this is the story we're telling? Or is that my personal story I'm telling? Like, I'm not really sure where we're going with this scene or where we're going with this moment or this relationship. What is this relationship of the story we're telling? And that really helped me clarify when I was telling the story we wanted to tell as a team versus maybe bringing in too much of my personal experience to it. So I think for me, that was very useful. And I feel very safe with Catherine to have those conversations with her. So I think that was really helpful. I definitely noticed myself, I am a mom of a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old. And so I noticed myself sometimes treating the younger actors, particularly Grace, who plays my daughter, like a kid, like she was my kid. She's actually a 21-year-old woman, and I sometimes had to be like, I'm sorry, I'm being your mom, because that's actually not really appropriate, right? So she's a grown woman. I shouldn't be acting like her mom and telling her to tie her shoes. That's not my job, or whatever, So just having to sort of check myself in that too, because you do sort of, especially as women, I think we can sort of go, oh, I'm taking care of everyone, or I'm doing this, and letting my personal momness come into my work momness. So those are just more thoughts on that.
Let me ask you all, what do you think about an audience? Like, we want to have these conversations. We want to present this work. We want to talk about these issues, but they are difficult and sensitive. And is it helpful in terms of our audience and and maybe Stephanie, you can chime in. Does it move us further in dealing with these issues as a culture? Did any of you have a sense of that from, and maybe I'll ask Stephanie, does it help to put these issues on stage? And we as women artists want to tell this story, and we want to talk about it. And as we saw in Me Too, it took a little while, but women started coming forward and telling their stories, and I think it's healing. But as a community, do you think it helps, even though you as theater people have to do a lot of work to get us there? Anybody? What do you think?
Isn't that,
Catherine?
but I sort of feel like, right, that's why we make art. I mean, yes, I'm of the opinion that if certainly there's room for light, fun, comedy, whatever. But even then, I feel like theater is telling the story of human existence, and so we as artists are presenting something to the audience and hoping that they'll think about it or consider it, or it'll affect them in some way. That's one of the reasons that this play, I think, is so wonderful and amazing, is that every single character is right and every single character is wrong, the same way that people are. And so I feel like the first time I read the play, I had my partner read it right after, and he and I had a 45-minute heated discussion about which character we thought was right or wrong. And I know that is the experience of a number of other people who have seen this play. And that's, for me, that's what it's all about. That's why we make them. So.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, art is, the mirror up to humanity and showing it to us. And there's a certain catharsis that happens in a space. It's kind of like a spiritual experience, because you're all in the same place and you all experience something for that first time. And there's that kinetic energy between the performers and the audience. And there's a thing happens that you can't really recreate. And theater comes from religion and spirituality. And so I think that these stories are what makes us human, but we need to know how to process it and how to become better humans and how to treat each other better through the revealing of these stories. It's like, little kids' stories can't all be happy. They've got to have some depth to it in order to understand why they feel the way they do. And I think that's what art is.
Right.
You-
Right.
I wanted to share, can I share something in response to that question?
Sure. Sure.
After the reading, the first reading we had of this, I had a friend of mine who came to it and brought two teenagers, and one teenager had to leave during the reading, and at the end of it revealed to their mom something that had happened to them that they had never told before, because it prompted them to say, oh, you know, I was trying to keep this from you, but I probably should tell it for all these reasons. And that's a very positive thing that I think can happen. I did have people come tell me things after seeing the show, that had happened to them. And then her other child, was a senior in high school, and he didn't say anything to her, but on the way home in the car called his girlfriend. He said, you know, have I ever made you feel this way? Do I ever make any jokes like this? Did I ever do this? And to me, like, I can ask for a better reaction than somebody like having empathy for somebody in their life in a new way. So I just wanted to share. I had lots of stories from a lot of people. I'm sure the actors and Catherine may have as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think that I sometimes I was wondering, because I'm kind of in a bubble of, yes, we're telling these stories, and yes, and I just wondered if, you know, are we making a difference? Does it help? Does it help? And Stephanie, maybe you can answer this. Does it help? Because there is that triggering aspect, and some people get triggered. And so, but ultimately, is it people who see it and take it forward, or tell Jean their story, or tell their mother their story?
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead.
the power of storytelling is overwhelming at times, right? And there's the danger of one single story. There is not one story. I think, Catherine, you said like everyone's right and everyone's wrong. And that, like, one of the beautiful things about this piece is that it leans into the complexity of both the individual experience and the connection with larger systems, right? And I mean, this is when we think about the larger systems at play here, right? Specifically of patriarchy and how we are all socialized into this patriarchal system. The only way that we are going to disrupt that system and create a more like equitable and just world is by becoming aware of it. And so, Jean, that story that you just shared of the boy who called his girlfriend, like, that's the work, right? Because patriarchy hurts everyone. It doesn't just hurt women, it hurts everyone. And this is like, in order for us to have a better world for our kids and to treat each other in a way that is really fostering community and creating more equity and justice across all of the places, like, we have to be aware of these stories. Just because you don't talk about it doesn't mean it's not there, right? It's like visibility is important for connection. And it's not a game of peekaboo. Like, these are our stories. This is like how people are experiencing the world. And it's not something that we can be, shying away from. It's something I think that we need to be really embracing hearing the stories. And to the point about folks being triggered, like, people are triggered every day, all of the time, in so many different ways, right? Like, going through the world is triggering. Like, we have not mentioned He Who Must Not Be Named and the re-election, right? Like, that happened today. People are re-triggered and activated now because of that presence in our culture. And so if there is an activation and triggering that happens, like, how do we then support each other in knowing how to regulate ourselves and trust in the process of like fostering a sense of safety for each other, right? So triggers are going to happen. It's then, how do we respond to those triggers? How do we know how are we like in just relation with each other and with ourselves, and know our needs well enough that we can move forward? So yes, it may have been triggering, and you know, work is hard and you can be triggered and still be okay. And that actually is like the beauty of like my years of trauma work. I love doing it so much because it's there, you get better. Like you can have the most like the horrible things of the world go on and the resilience of the human spirit remains. And that's not always true, but in many cases it is, and can actually be really beautiful. So thank you, Jean, for this piece.
I think something that Jean did, and in thinking about some other shows I've worked on that have had very violence or sexual violence, domestic violence. And I'm curious if this was conscious, Jean, because we've actually not talked about it, is that all of the assault happens off stage. And what we're really seeing is the human fallout from this, you know, how the assaults are affecting the relationships of the people in this family. Something that I think, one reason I think that this play is digestible from people, and I heard from so many people, I mean, the number one word we got, you know, I heard from people was intense. Like everyone else, so many people like had different people they agreed with or disagreed with. So many people left talking about this show for multiple days. My kids left, talked to their dad for 45 minutes after seeing the show. It was like huge and that. But I also wondered, Jean, if did you consciously think about the fact that you didn't want to bring the violence on stage or the sexual trauma onto the stage and more top, or no?
I'm going to interrupt you. There is one.
Well, there is the slap.
That is an act of violence.
That is true. That is an act of violence, and that is traumatizing. I was referring to the sexual assaults. I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, because my you always go back to what was the kernel or what was your impetus for writing the play, and my impetus was thinking about all those women who were triggered into feeling such a sense of vulnerability, who were afraid to leave their houses for the first time in a long time because of what some guy said and was on the media now all the time. And so for me, that was the story I wanted to tell, because I don't think that's talked about enough, how somebody can say something that one person thinks is innocuous or should be reacted to one way, but it can have a completely different reaction from somebody else. And so that's why I made that decision.
I'm gonna, on that note, I'm gonna open it up to see if we have, unless somebody else has anything they want to add. Nicole, did you have anything you wanted to add? I don't want to put you on the spot. We can open it up to questions from our audience and see if you have any questions for anyone about the discussion, about the production, the work on the production, or your response to it.